He entered the courtroom, frightened, head down, in disbelief, hands cuffed, very thin, covered by an old coat that looked like it hadn't been washed even once. His shoes, were so worn that one foot showed skin. His face had more than wrinkles and signs of age. His expression betrayed abandonment. A human being already too old and frail to appear threatening or someone inclined to steal or escape from that situation. When the gavel fell firmly, Judge Sarah Martinez sentenced the homeless veteran to 6 months in jail in that county for trespassing. But what she didn't know was that the man handcuffed before her chained had already carried her dead brother's body 3 miles through enemy fire to bring him home. Antonio Rodriguez, 71, of no fixed address, arrested for sleeping behind a bakery one night when temperatures dropped to 12 degrees below zero. The courtroom was cold, almost hostile, and in the back corner. I silently emptied the trash cans while the night janitor, the Uncle Sam, who worked as a janitor in this courtroom, watched what I thought was just another routine case of the justice system processing society's forgotten. But when the judge read the defendant's full name aloud, Antonio Carlos Rodriguez, United States Army, retired, something in her voice cracked, and I saw her hand freeze over the paperwork as recognition dawned in her eyes. What happened next would transform that sterile courtroom into a place of redemption and honor that brought grown men to tears. Because Judge Martinez suddenly realized that the homeless vagrant she was about to send to prison was the same sergeant who had saved her brother's life in Afghanistan, the man David had written about in letters home, the hero who had carried him to safety when everyone else thought he was already dead. But Antonio didn't recognize her. 20 years of trauma, addiction, and living on the streets had stripped away everything except the memories that haunted his dreams. Before I tell you how this incredible story of military brotherhood and forgotten sacrifice unfolded in that courtroom, let me ask you something that might hit close to home. Have you ever encountered a homeless veteran and wondered what their story was? Drop your city in the comments and tell me if you've ever helped someone who served our country but was forgotten by the system they once protected. Because what you're about to hear will change how you see every person living on the streets. Now, forgive me for taking a moment to adjust my position here. My knees aren't what they used to be after decades of cleaning courthouse floors, and frankly, at my age, these stories of honor and sacrifice require me to sit down properly. Thank you for your patience with an old janitor who's witnessed more courtroom drama than most lawyers. But this case will stay with me until the day I die. To understand how Sergeant Antonio Rodriguez went from decorated war hero to homeless defendant, we need to go back 22 years to a dusty outpost in Afghanistan where 2 young soldiers formed a bond that would transcend death itself. David Martinez was 19 years old, fresh out of basic training, scared but determined to serve his country with honor. Antonio Rodriguez was 28, a seasoned NCO who had already survived 2 deployments and understood that keeping young soldiers alive was more important than following every regulation by the book. David S. letters home to his sister. Sarah painted Antonio as larger than life, a tough but caring leader who taught him how to stay calm under fire, how to read the terrain for danger signs, and most importantly, how to never leave a brother behind. Sergeant Rodriguez treats us like his own sons, David wrote in one letter that Sarah kept for decades. He says the mission is important, but bringing everyone home alive is what really matters. If something happens to me out here, I know Sarge will make sure I get home to you. The mission that would forge their eternal bond began on October 15th, 2002, when their patrol was ambushed while investigating reports of weapons caches in a village 30 miles from their forward operating base. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously, pinning down the 8-man squad in an abandoned compound with no cover and no clear escape route. Within the first 10 minutes, 3 soldiers were down, including David Martinez, who had taken shrapnel from an RPG explosion that left him unconscious and bleeding heavily from multiple wounds. What Antonio Rodriguez did next would become the stuff of military legend, though few people outside that squad would ever know the full story. Under heavy enemy fire, he crawled 50 yards across open ground to reach David's position, dragged the unconscious soldier to partial cover, and then made the decision that would haunt and define the rest of his life. With enemy forces closing in and ammunition running low, Antonio chose to stay with the wounded rather than retreat with the rest of the squad. For 6 hours, Antonio held that position, using David's body armor and his own to create a makeshift shield while calling in artillery strikes and coordinating. With helicopter support, when rescue finally arrived, they found Antonio still conscious but badly wounded, having used his own field dressings to stop David's bleeding while ignoring his own injuries. The medics said later that David would have died within 30 minutes without Antonio's field treatment and protection. David Martinez survived that ambush and completed his tour of duty, returning home with stories of the sergeant who had saved his life and promises to stay in touch with the man he considered his second father. But like so many military friendships, the connection gradually faded as civilian life took over and the intensity of combat became something both men preferred to leave buried in the past. What David never knew was that Antonio's war had never really ended. The sergeant completed 2 more deployments after that ambush, each one adding layers of trauma and survivor's guilt that military psychiatrists were just beginning to understand. When Antonio finally returned to civilian life in 2005, he carried invisible wounds that the Department of Veterans Affairs was poorly equipped to treat. The transition from respected military leader to struggling civilian was brutal and swift. Antonio's marriage collapsed within 6 months of his return, destroyed by nightmares, panic attacks, and an inability to connect with a world that seemed trivial after years of life and death decisions. His attempts to find meaningful civilian employment were frustrated by employers who saw his military experience as irrelevant or even concerning. The descent into homelessness began with small compromises and incremental losses. First, Antonio moved from his family home to a small apartment, then from the apartment to a single room, then from the room to his car. Finally, when the car was repossessed, to the streets where he would spend the next 15 years surviving day by day while the memories of Afghanistan played on endless loop in his mind. The irony was devastating. The man who had saved David Martinez's life by refusing to abandon his post had been abandoned by the very system he had served with such distinction. Despite being eligible for disability benefits, medical care, and housing assistance, Antonio's pride and his deteriorating mental state prevented him from navigating the bureaucratic maze required to access those services. Meanwhile, David's sister Sarah had built a successful legal career, eventually becoming a judge known for her fairness and her particular sensitivity to cases involving veterans and mental health issues. She kept David's letters in a box in her office, occasionally rereading them when she needed to remember why justice mattered, and why some people deserve special consideration from a system that too often forgot their sacrifices. The night that would bring Antonio and Sarah together began like hundreds of others in his 15-year journey through homelessness. Temperatures had dropped below freezing, and the usual shelters were full or closed due to budget cuts. Antonio had learned to survive by finding warm places that were technically private property but unlikely to be discovered by security guards or police officers. The back alley behind Martinez's family. Bakery offered protection from the wind and residual heat from the ovens that ran all night preparing bread for the morning customers. Antonio had slept there twice before without incident, curled up between empty flour sacks and cardboard, trying to stay warm enough to survive until sunrise. What Antonio didn't know was that the bakery's security system had been upgraded the previous week and his presence triggered a silent alarm that brought police officers who were required by law to arrest anyone found trespassing on commercial property. The officers who found him weren't cruel, but they weren't sympathetic either. Just professionals doing their job of removing an unwanted person from private property. Antonio didn't resist arrest or argue with the charges. After 15 years on the streets, he understood that the legal system viewed him as a problem to be processed, rather than a human being deserving of consideration. He expected to spend a few days in county jail, plead guilty to trespassing, and receive time served plus probation that he would inevitably violate by having nowhere legal to sleep. The arraignment hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m. Tuesday morning in Judge Sarah Martinez's courtroom, as the night janitor responsible for cleaning that courtroom. I had arrived at 5 a.m. to empty trash cans, mop floors, and prepare the space for another day of legal proceedings. I had cleaned hundreds of similar hearings over the years. Routine cases involving people whose biggest crime was being poor and having nowhere else to go. Judge Martinez arrived early that morning, as was her habit, to review the day's cases and prepare for what looked like a standard docket of minor offenses and procedural hearings. She had no reason to expect that one of those routine cases would connect her to the most important person in her late brother's military service. Antonio entered the courtroom in shackles wearing the same clothes he had been arrested in. A worn military surplus jacket that had kept him warm for 5 winter's pants that had been patched multiple times in boots, so deteriorated that his left foot touched the ground through a hole in the sole. His appearance was exactly what people expected from someone arrested for vagrancy: defeated, invisible, and easily dismissed. I watched from my position near the back of the courtroom as the prosecutor read the charges in a bored voice that suggested this was just another homeless case to be processed efficiently. Antonio stood silently, his eyes focused on the floor, his shoulders curved inward in the posture of someone who had learned not to expect anything good from interactions with authority figures. Judge Martinez was reviewing the paperwork when she read the defendant's full name aloud for the court record. Antonio Carlos Rodriguez, United States Army, retired, 71 years old. No fixed address. The words came out automatically. But I saw her pause and look up at the defendant with sudden attention, as if something in that name had triggered a memory she couldn't quite place. Let me pause here for just a moment to take a sip of water and gather my thoughts. Stories like this one always affect me deeply, because they remind me how many heroes walk among us unrecognized, how many people we dismiss as failures without knowing the sacrifices they've made for others. At my age, with so many years of witnessing human drama in courtrooms and corporate boardrooms, I well learned that the most important stories are often hidden beneath the surface of what we think we see. Judge Martinez asked Antonio to state his full name and military service record for the court. His voice was barely audible as he confirmed his identity and mentioned his years of service in Afghanistan. I saw the judge's hand tremble slightly as she wrote notes, and then she did something unusual. She asked the bailiff to bring her a specific file from her office, claiming she needed to verify military service information for sentencing purposes. What she was really doing was retrieving the box of letters her brother had sent home from Afghanistan. Letters she had kept in her office for 20 years as reminders of sacrifice and service. While the courtroom waited, Judge Martinez quickly searched through those letters until she found the ones that mentioned Sergeant Rodriguez by name. Descriptions of the man who had saved David's life and earned his eternal gratitude. When Judge Martinez returned to the bench, her entire demeanor had changed. Instead of the efficient processing of a routine case, she began asking Antonio detailed questions about his military service, his time in Afghanistan, and specifically about a mission in October 2002, where he had served with a young soldier named David Martinez. The transformation in Antonio was immediate and heartbreaking. At the mention of David's name, his head snapped up for the first time since entering the courtroom. His eyes focused on the judge with sudden recognition and confusion. David Martinez, he repeated slowly, as if testing whether the name was real or just another flashback. Young kid, always talking about his sister who was going to be a lawyer. Sweet kid. Reminded me of my own son. Judge Martinez had to pause to compose herself before continuing. When she spoke again, her voice carried emotion that filled the entire courtroom with tension and anticipation. Sergeant Rodriguez, David Martinez, was my brother. And according to his letters home, you saved his life during an ambush that should have killed him. You carried him to safety and stayed with him under enemy fire until help arrived. The silence that followed was profound and transformative. Antonio stared at the judge as 20 years of suppressed memories crashed over him like a flood. The prosecutor looked confused, unsure whether this personal connection was appropriate for a criminal proceeding. The bailiffs and court reporters recognized that they were witnessing something extraordinary that transcended normal legal procedures. Antonio's voice cracked as he spoke for the first time with real emotion. David made it home. He told me about his sister, said she was going to change the world through the law. He talked about you every day, showed me your picture. Is he ... Is he okay? The hope in that question was painful to witness because Judge Martinez had to tell him that David had died in a car accident just 5 years after. Returning from Afghanistan, but not before building a successful life that included marriage, children, and a career helping other veterans. What happened next will remain etched in my memory forever. Judge Martinez stood up from the bench, walked down to where Antonio stood in shackles, and spoke directly to him as David's sister rather than as a judge. Sergeant, my brother wrote that you were the bravest man he ever knew, that you treated your soldiers like sons, and that he owed his life to your courage and your refusal to leave anyone behind. He wanted to find you after the war, to thank you properly and to make sure you were okay. Antonio broke down completely. 20 years of buried grief and trauma pouring out in sobs that shook his entire body. Through his tears, he kept repeating, I should have done more. I should have kept him safer. I should have been a better sergeant. Judge Martinez knelt beside him and said the words that began his healing. Sergeant, you did everything right. You brought my brother home alive, and he got to live 5 more years because of your courage. Our family owes you a debt we can never repay. Judge Martinez then did something unprecedented in her judicial career. She recused herself from the case due to personal involvement and arranged for another judge to handle the legal proceedings. But before transferring the case, she used her judicial authority to order a complete military service review for Antonio Rodriguez, including verification of his combat record and assessment of his eligibility for veteran services. The court-ordered investigation revealed that Antonio had been awarded the Silver Star for his actions during the ambush that saved David Martinez, but the medal had never been presented due to administrative errors following his medical discharge. He was also entitled to full disability benefits, medical care, and housing assistance that he had never received because of bureaucratic failures and his own inability to navigate the system. Within 2 weeks, Antonio's life transformed completely. The trespassing charges were dismissed with prejudice, and he was enrolled in a comprehensive veteran services program that provided immediate housing, medical care, and psychological counseling. The delayed Silver Star presentation became a ceremonial event attended by local officials, military representatives, and dozens of veterans who wanted to honor a brother who had been forgotten by the system. But the most meaningful moment came when Judge Martinez privately presented Antonio with the original letters David had written about him, letters describing him as a hero and a father figure who had made it possible for a scared young soldier to come home alive. Reading those letters allowed Antonio to finally forgive himself for surviving when others hadn't, and to understand that his service had meaning that transcended his subsequent struggles. The bakery owner, learning about Antonio's story through media coverage of the case, offered him a job maintaining the building where he had once sought shelter from the cold. Antonio accepted, finding purpose in honest work and comfort in knowing that his presence was wanted rather than merely tolerated. Judge Martinez and Antonio maintained a relationship that honored David's memory while respecting the boundaries of their respective roles. She became an advocate for veteran services reform, using Antonio's case to highlight systemic failures that left heroes homeless and forgotten. He became a volunteer mentor for other veterans struggling with transition issues, using his experience to help others navigate challenges he had faced alone. The broader impact of their story extended far beyond one courthouse or one veteran's redemption. The case became a catalyst for legislative reforms that streamlined veteran services and created better support systems for former military personnel dealing with homelessness and mental health issues. As I continued my work as the night janitor in that courthouse, I often thought about the lesson Antonio and Judge Martinez had taught everyone who witnessed their reunion. Justice isn't just about applying laws and imposing sentences. It's about recognizing the humanity and sacrifice of every person who stands before the bench, especially those who have served others at great personal cost. The empty courtroom where I worked each night had been transformed from a place of routine legal processing into something resembling a shrine to honor and redemption. Every time I cleaned those floors, I remembered the moment when two lives connected across 20 years of separation and pain. When recognition replaced dismissal, and when a forgotten hero finally received the acknowledgement he deserved. Antonio's story also reminded me that heroism often comes in forms we don't expect. From people we overlook in circumstances that seem routine until we learn the deeper truth. The homeless veteran sleeping behind a bakery had once risked his life to save others. And the judge who might have sentenced him to jail time was connected to him through bonds of sacrifice and gratitude that transcended their apparent differences. Years later, Antonio continued working at the bakery, living in a modest apartment, and volunteering with veteran organizations. He never became wealthy or famous, but he achieved something more valuable: peace with his past and purpose in his present. The nightmares never completely stopped, but they were balanced by memories of the lives he had saved and the difference he continued to make. Judge Martinez advanced in her judicial career, eventually being appointed to the state appellate court, where she continued advocating for fair treatment of veterans and other vulnerable populations. She kept David's letters in her new office, along with a photograph of Antonio receiving his delayed Silver Star, as reminders that justice requires both compassion and courage. Their story became part of courthouse folklore, told and retold by lawyers, judges, and staff members who wanted to remember that the legal system at its best could be a place of redemption rather than mere punishment. The night janitor who had witnessed it all, that would be me. Uncle Sam never forgot the lesson that every person who enters a courtroom carries a story that deserves to be heard and understood. So what do you think about second chances and the way we treat our veterans? Have you ever discovered that someone you overlooked or dismissed had a story of heroism and sacrifice? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what city you're rewatching from, and share any experiences you've had with veterans who needed help but were too proud or too broken to ask for it. But before you go, I need to tell you about Uncle Sam's next story, because it involves something that will shock you about corporate greed and medical ethics. Picture this: a pharmaceutical company CEO who discovered that her company's new arthritis medication was causing fatal heart attacks in elderly patients. But instead of recalling the drug, she hired hitmen to eliminate the whistleblower doctors who tried to expose the truth. Make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell, because Uncle Sam's next investigation exposes the pharmaceutical executive who ordered murder to hide deadly side effects. Uncle Sam's evidence brought down a medical conspiracy that killed hundreds. The lesson from Antonio and Judge Martinez's story remains clear. Honor and sacrifice deserve recognition regardless of how much time has passed or how far someone has fallen. Because every person we encounter might be carrying invisible wounds from serving others, and every interaction is an opportunity to show the respect and compassion that heroes deserve. And sometimes it takes a moment of recognition in an unlikely place to remind us all that justice and redemption are possible. When we choose to see the humanity in every person who stands before us,